Your face looks like your mother's.
Thanks. Yours looks like a butt.
And you have your father's mouth.
Round 1, fight!
Hello greater YouTube area and the surrounding internet regions, this is Killer Cardinal DA7. Of all the things I'm looking to accomplish while working on this channel, I'm not looking to debate with people on my ideas. I know just saying that must make me look like a giant chicken shit, but if you've seen any of my other content before this, you'll know that I have a reason for saying most of the things I stand by. Important topics in society and the way we talk about them on YouTube, it all has far-reaching consequences. What we say in any public forum in regard to sensitive subjects can guide millions of people to change the courses of their lives. They can shape how our country functions. The discussions I want to see started and that I want to engage in, and the outcomes of those discussions, those things don't come from debate. The whole idea of a debate is that two or more people are competing to see who's right. Actually resolving the issue at hand takes a back seat to simply defeating an opponent, and a lot of the time, there isn't even a clear defeat. I mentioned this in my video called Proving Truth in Fake News. It's not like engaging in debate leads to people who compete to wildly change their worldviews. I'm sure that will prompt people seeing this to shove YouTube clips in my face of it actually happening. Hey, if it does happen, I'd be delighted to be wrong about that. More debates should go that way. Strong enough arguments should be as close to commonly held truth as possible. If it doesn't happen though, then my point stands. You've seen it happen yourself. When debate occurs, whether online or offline, the debate ends, back to your corners, no one changes. World keeps spinning until the next one starts. People continue to argue and fight and despise each other. You may have won the battle, but the war is far from over. And you know how it is, the war never fucking ends. People only identify more with the most passionate soldiers for the cause, and while each war wages, well, the fight's turning personal is inevitable, isn't it? Internet and drama go hand in hand. They say sometimes arguments can be productive. I believe that, but in order for arguments to be productive, all parties involved need to be focused on the same goal, and often, people who argue, especially online, don't have goals that are even close to similar. If problems got solved in society, I'd put up with the drama, but the drama and problems are only exacerbating each other. That sounds a little naughty. Let me try it another way. But the drama and problems are only exacerbating each other with their hands and mouths. That's better. And the deluge of debates doesn't seem to be quieting any of that noise. It's just creating more and more chaos. This isn't to say healthy civil debates can occur. They certainly can. I have faith that they can. I feel like the more important and urgent the topic, the more emotional and driven people become to be right about it, and therefore, the less competition there should be about it. The important topic in question just gets used as a platform for two people who want to battle wits, and coming to an agreement and solving the problem ends up being this ancillary side quest that no one really cares about. Two people want to cross-promote, so they duke it out verbally, prompting thousands to create little Cliff's Notes style 1.5 minute clip re-uploads. So-and-so destroys such and such with one sentence. You've seen them. They're almost always taken wildly out of context too. Don't get me wrong, competition's all fine and good on its own. If you want to compete with me in anything, pick a video game, even one I don't own, challenge me in PvP, and we'll go at it. You'll probably wipe the floor with me. I might get mildly better before we stop as I learn the game mechanics and your personal tactics. But once we do stop, I'll give you a hearty good game, and that'll be that. I'd much rather compete in a game's PvP mode, something I'm fairly comfortable acknowledging that I'm utter shit at, and compete when there's very little consequence, than try to debate with someone battling not just their wits but their identity, their passion to craft the most damaging zinger as if that has any importance in life at all, the bandoliers of stats and websites and proof that they have within arm's reach to shove in my face as if they have a giant pile of smoking guns, some of which are made of plastic but painted to look quote real, all under the guise of solving a complex problem in society and making barely a ding in the process. I've said numerous times since starting this channel that I want to encourage discussion and hopefully dissipate arguments via compromise. That means calmly talking out a problem, maturely sharing ideas, putting myself in another person's shoes to see their side. Raising voices sometimes is fine, but ultimately staying on topic and moving the discussion forward to an action item that we agree on. At least that's what I hope to be able to do, even if people I speak with don't always do the same. I'm not so deluded to think that my time here on YouTube will be completely drama-free. I'm positive attacks and harassment are only a matter of time as opposed to something I can avoid entirely. But I am intrigued by the opportunity to turn someone who harshly criticizes my content and laces their comments to the brim with insults, name-calling, racial slurs, hatred, or any other similar treatment into a friend, a subscriber, a loyal viewer, or all three. It's become commonplace for a lot of people to just toss anyone being negative into the troll bucket. Trolls essentially is the term used for people who just say useless shit in comments hoping to antagonize others into reacting, whether they're an author, artist, creator, or other commenters. By quote feeding trolls, a person is giving into that person's desire for attention and thus giving them more to use as antagonism. I've never formally trolled anyone. If I have, it wasn't in any vulgar way or even on purpose, but I have been criticized plenty for feeding trolls. Thing is, as I put more videos on YouTube, I'm becoming more fascinated with the idea that while some people troll others online, some people are likely called trolls when they aren't really. Anyone who gets called a troll, whether deserved or not, they want attention. Most of us can agree with that. Most of us in general, though, want attention, especially online where I imagine most people want their fair share of the attention. And if a troll leans heavily on antagonism to get it, embracing them and treating what they feel or believe as having some sliver of legitimacy could yield interesting results. For now, I'm eager to dig below the surface, but could be I'm just being masochistic. I'll have to let you know how that progresses. In this video, I want to talk about some of the tactics people use during their debates and arguments. Most of them have distinct names. Some of them are logical fallacies. I don't know if they all are. The list of tactics just seems to grow every day, and what's almost a bigger problem is that the criteria needed to be any of these things just seems to expand as the intention people have of even discussing these things becomes more to show why a person isn't even allowed to speak, and less to point out why a single argument made to prove a point is faulty, and then helping a person make a better case. If it were the latter more than the former, we'd have much more productive discussions. Perhaps. Then again, if people are half as set in their ways as I'm implying, if one of their arguments gets called out as faulty, they'll just jump to the next one and hope that that will be the keystone they need to tear down their opponent's arch. And if that doesn't work, they'll just keep ripping out stones until everything falls down. Fuck it, if I'm not right, no one will be. So, if people are that intent on fighting, chances are fair to good that you too will find yourself in a battle. And the best thing you can do is fight smart and be prepared for what someone throws at you. I want to look at some of the tactics people use either in arguments or out of them, whether intentionally or accidentally, deconstruct some of those tactics, see what they're made of, and ultimately see what can be done when they come up. Some of these things can be navigated in real time, some of them can't, or can't as well as others. Also, I'm not going to leave myself out, I'm probably guilty of some of them. If you see any of my content and think I'm guilty, feel free to call it out. I'll do my best to defend my position, explain what I mean better. Just because you call it out doesn't make it true, but I'll do my best to be honest if you call it right. Let's go one at a time and start with something you see every single day on social media in bare minimum, I'm going to estimate 5 memes. Something that people as high as President Trump and other political candidates at his level have used: personal inconsistency, proving hypocrisy in others. This is some popular shit right here. People calling others a hypocrite in the shortest time and smallest space, articles all over the internet, clickbait, headlines, sponsored content. The sources of this are endless and infinite. The consensus seems to be that if you successfully prove a person is inconsistent or hypocritical, then they have nothing valid to say. Google defines hypocrisy as, quote, the practice of claiming to have moral standards or beliefs to which one's own behavior does not conform. Essentially saying one thing and doing another, often the opposite, sometimes with a distinct disparity between the morality of what you say and the morality of what you do. One of the most common ways this is expressed is by calling someone's past into question. It doesn't even matter how far back you gotta go. It could be 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 25 years ago. If somebody did something in their past that doesn't match what they're doing now, they're deemed a hypocrite. And what they say from then on is devalued in the accuser's eyes. The reason hypocrisy is such an effective attack tactic, I think, is that no one ever really dwells on what they're called out for. Sometimes they do a little bit. They'll give an explanation or an apology. They'll say it was a long time ago or that times were different. What I mean by dwell is to go deep into the details that caused their position to change. Detail how they felt all those years ago, possibly admitting to a feeling that could bring about judgment or embarrassment, and then detail the process by which that changed. And not just once, but repeat it subsequent times to remind people that a distinct change occurred. As I said earlier, this is extremely common with politicians who are most often standing with a particular party affiliation. And if they don't vote for policies that are in line with the party's ideals, they're accused by voters, opponents, and sometimes their own party mates of flip-flopping. In other words, jumping back and forth between ideologies if it means getting votes or raising approval ratings. But like everything else in this discussion, we need to look at the intention of accusing someone of that. Usually the idea is that a person who flip-flops can't be trusted. They're not following the ideals that we believe. They're not following the rules we set forth. They're going rogue and they need to be stopped. They're a traitor. They betrayed us and turned against us. That's the mindset I see happening. People do in fact flip-flop, politicians especially. They live and breathe by what their voters want. They're basically the hand that carries out the whims of the people. At least they're supposed to be. And if citizens flip-flop the changing of the weather, politicians will do the same. If they want to keep getting votes, they'll damn sure change. Like I said though, how often do politicians really explain the factors that go into having a major change of heart? They always look genuine to their most passionate supporters, but how many of them actually are? Hard to say. Most of the time when we hear about a politician changing stance on something, it's either secretly or else extremely subtly. They'll go into it once and basically never address it again. I linked in the description 2 videos of both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama from 13 years ago, 2004, stating that they don't support gay marriage in fairly clear terms. Obviously, if you asked either one now, or looked at their most recent statements in public, they'd say the opposite, gay marriage becoming legal via the Supreme Court during Obama's second term. Okay, they changed stances, that's fine, happens all the time. But how often do the most current statements get front-loaded with mentions of the past? I used to be against gay marriage, but now I'm not because... What exactly went into their decision to change? How long will they stand by that change? And from our perspectives, does sticking to an ideal long enough prove that a person really feels that way? I linked in the description photos of little Hillary Rodham, aged 3, at a gay pride rally in 1950, and another of fetal Barack Obama waving a rainbow flag inside the womb. Clearly these two were, quote, allies at very young ages. Hell yes, hashtag love is love. I didn't link those things, don't look for them. Sticking to an ideal long enough doesn't prove a person feels a certain way. That ideal could just be tradition, and there are plenty of traditions that could use an overhaul. Not everything traditional needs changing, but not every tradition should just stay as they are because they've been tradition. It's understandable when people change, circumstances in the world change, motivations change, and those circumstances can often adjust our perspectives. It happened to me recently. After Donald Trump was elected, the Worldwide Women's March took place, and one sign that was held up during the festivities said, "So bad, even introverts are here." When I saw that, I remember thinking, fuck you. Just because someone doesn't wear their heart on their their sleeve 24/7, that doesn't mean they're some hermit basement dweller with no opinions. But the more I try to fight that sentiment, the sillier it felt. I don't have a personal vendetta for Trump or Obama or Clinton or Bush or Bernie or Jill Stein or anybody. But one thing we can all agree on is that things are bad in this country right now. They're twitchy, they're touchy, shit gets crazy at the drop of a hat. And if I can appreciate Trump for one thing during his presidency, he's getting people motivated. No one can deny that. Things are bad in this country, but they're changing rapidly. And for a lot of people, cross your fingers that the side you choose is the right one. Here's the cards falling neatly in the end. Salute. When it comes to politicians, most of us would agree that it's best to assess action and not speech, right? Mainly because actions like policymaking and law passing are what affects real people most. Trump can tweet whatever he wants, and at the end of the day, what matters most is the policies he puts into place. However, unfortunately, what politicians say is sometimes just as important, as it's the best way to tell what they may or may not propose to get passed. Politicians love saying, I'm going to lower taxes, and people go, oh shit, yes, I would love lower taxes. You, sir and or ma'am, have my vote. They get the vote, they get elected, where's my tax cut? Meanwhile, there has to have been a politician who didn't say anything about cutting taxes and did it during their term, and it ended up being a pleasant surprise. Which would you rather have? High hopes that don't come to fruition, or lower expectations with higher results that may not look as stellar as the hopes? You can look at only their actions or only their speech, but in either case, you're probably missing something. The only way for them to really prove where they stand on any given topic at any given moment is for them to never stop talking and be completely transparent about every decision they make, up to and including when voting for particular things. You've seen this happen too. A politician will sometimes get accused of being against one or more things due to voting a certain way, but at least at times it was loaded into something else, making voting against it accidental or unintentional, or voting for other things was more important than the one issue in question. There are a lot more moving parts and deeper tales to be told. And for average citizens not having to deal with issues in that type of way where it requires making real decisions that affect others with policy or law, average people can flip-flop 1,000 times a day because there's no consequence, no punishment, no threat. No one corners any of them and holds them to a stance and forces them to defend it or justify it. Hell, these days it's seen as admirable being unapologetic. Hashtag sorry not sorry. And when a person deigns to hang out briefly in a confrontation, when you're online, there's always an escape. So they're actually doing you a favor by even talking to you about something obvious that they shouldn't really need to remind you of. They'll often try some really common tactics to fight back when they feel their securities are being threatened. It's becoming easier and easier to pick out. There are whole websites dedicated to it. I've linked a bunch of them in the description. Like the good old-fashioned red herring. That's when you redirect the conversation onto another issue to avoid having to address the original issue. You tell a significant other you'll go to the store on the way home from work, you forget to go, and when they call you and not going, you say work got really stressful and talk about your coworkers and workload for 20 minutes. Work isn't the issue. The issue is that you forgot and the store still needs to be visited. Maybe the store can wait another day. That's not a crisis. But being forgetful or distracted are more personal problems that might need to be addressed if they happen often enough. Diverting things to talking about work or stress doesn't solve the problems, and by diverting, a person isn't taking responsibility. The story among many people is that Donald Trump won the presidential election due to involvement with Russian hackers, influencers, and potentially the Russian government itself. In truth, he won by a slim margin in some states. Had the Democratic Party not been so scattered and splintered and so busy playing identity politics, sometimes against each other, had they cooperated and come together for one goddamn moment and agreed on a fucking ticket to defeat a loudmouth reality TV con man, whether that ticket had Hillary on it, Bernie, or anyone else that people could have agreed on, that slim a margin per state wouldn't have even been an issue. I'm not saying Trump didn't actually collude with Russia at all. Sure seems like he did at least a little. The Facebook advertising push from Russian sources, the secret meetings have been detailed. Clearly some connection exists. Communication has been happening. Unfortunately, there's been so much talk about Russia for almost a year now. If any of it had any real legs, had anything come out that was truly concrete enough, you don't think the FBI or the CIA wouldn't want to look like heroes that took down a massive conspiracy and regained some public confidence? Trump would have been brought in for testimony months ago if the Russia connection was standing on any type of solid ground. Yeah, look at him. He's still golfing, still taking bi-weekly vacations. He seems to be in no danger. A red herring seems to be winning here. Liberals seem really wrapped up in hoping the Russia thing takes him down when there may not be any payoff. How about the slippery slope argument? That's one we've all heard of, easy one to grasp. And you make the case that the high rate of progression proves a prediction of yours, regardless of having little to no evidence to prove it a sensible prediction otherwise. Perfect example, when someone attempts to argue against gay marriage, well, if we let same-sex couples marry, what next? Marrying pets? Marrying inanimate objects? If you make any future prediction, you want to be prepared for someone to accuse you of a slippery slope, and the best way to do that is to mentally map out how current events lead to your prediction. If someone accuses you of it, you can illustrate your roadmap, and hopefully, if you can describe in detail why your prediction makes sense, or even cite examples of that progression occurring, you stand on much firmer ground. To be clear, I'm completely for gay marriage, but firmly against letting people marry pets and inanimate objects. I do happen to think if a law were made that legalized or legitimized marrying pets and objects, plenty of people would go and do both. We already have people out there who view their pets as children or babies, tons of people who post memes on social media daily about how they love their pets more than most people. Also, you may want to go ahead and Google people marrying inanimate objects, as clearly that's happening more than any of us would like to admit. Faith in humanity equals through the roof. However, while the assumption used to be that people would never marry animals or objects, despite that that aspect changing, legalizing marriage between same-sex human couples never directly proved people would be or are marrying their couches or their cars. Saying people would marry those things was never a valid claim to make why marriage shouldn't be allowed between two conscious, lucid adult humans of sound mind and body who happen to be the same sex. Another tactic. Gaslighting. This is a manipulation tactic where one person causes the other to think they're crazy and thus their argument is thrown off, often by either misinterpreting their speech or actions or reacting to something that isn't there. Sometimes it can involve making an assessment that seems harmless but in actuality can be antagonistic. Describing it this way may make it seem like it's easy to pick out, but when you read about examples or illustrations of it, it can occur very subtly or sideswipe you. It can be hard to identify. With a slippery slope argument, you have a distinct way of proving how slippery the slope is. You can look at point A and point B, and if the person making the argument has a hard time, as I said, mapping out the route between them, a slope that's slippery enough, so to speak, has less and less merit. With this, though, someone can change their stance or back off a statement or cause you to think you forgot how an encounter went, and the offense may not even be noticed. I put a link in the description that shows 3 examples, and I'll explain how I think they should go and where they may be missing parts of the story. In the first example, Andrew calls out his father's aggressiveness and name-calling, and Andrew's father accuses Andrew of being too sensitive. The example in the link only says that Andrew's father calls him names, which doesn't need to be accepted. Andrew could say, I don't appreciate being called a bastard and a worthless loser by my father. That's not about sensitivity, it's about knowing how to treat another human being with respect. It may not solve the problem in one fell swoop, and it may even instigate his father into becoming aggressive in the moment, but it keeps the attention on his father's aggressiveness and the effect it has, which are what Andrew went to talk about. In the example between Jade and Mike, Jade has been working on building a store and asked her husband Mike for help with it. Mike yells at her for neglecting their family and kids. Jade explains she was just asking for help. Mike yells at her that she's denying neglecting their family. Then when she speaks to him later about it, he claims she was overreacting and spending too much time on the store. Jade could have asked, am I neglecting anyone by, and then provide a list of things she does for the family. She could have asked, why is it working on this shop says to you that I don't care about you? Do you feel my time is not split enough? I'm asking you to help me. Obviously I care about you, otherwise I wouldn't ask you for help. She could have responded to his deflection or misinterpretation by presenting him with a really simple option. If you didn't want to help or couldn't, Mike, you could just say no instead of accusing me of not caring. In that example, Mike says a bunch of things. Jade responds with one line and barely any investigation on what he said. I see how it's gaslighting. Mike is reacting to apathy and distraction on his wife's part as if that's what's true, and that's absolutely the wrong way to handle an encounter like that, no doubt. But there's more Jade could have done to corner Mike and call him out more effectively than just saying no. I admit a lot of times you need to go with the flow of someone you're arguing with, but pulling the conversation back to the issue is still necessary. In the third example, Sophie gets a promotion. Her supervisor Kelly gives her more and more menial tasks she can't accomplish. Then Kelly claims in front of everyone at a staff meeting that Sophie isn't, quote, embodying our hardworking ethics, but she'll catch up eventually. Sophie asks Kelly about the comment, and Kelly rewords it slightly to make it seem like she said that so others would help her. The problem is Kelly in the meeting didn't say, Sophie's new to the position, is anyone free to give her a hand? And when Sophie asked about it afterward, Kelly didn't offer help. Instead of the meeting, Kelly says Sophie's not embodying a hard work ethic, which may not be true. Obviously, if she's trying hard, she's working hard, and ethic probably goes with that. But too much may be on her plate. That's a problem anyone can encounter, even those with phenomenal time management skills. Are we to assume Kelly blew her off, lied about getting Sophie help? Was she condescending? Did Sophie just walk away silently after Kelly reworded what happened? The examples in the article from lonerwolf.com, there's just pieces missing. We can put some of it together on our own, but it's not always so concrete. Especially when the motivations to even argue some of these things in particular ways isn't clear either. With gaslighting, there are aspects that can sometimes change shape almost in real time. In order to successfully navigate this, it seems like a person needs to be extra nimble and aware of what's being said and what needs to be talked about, and yet still tread lightly so as not to make a problem worse. How about a straw man argument? Everyone loves those. A straw man is when someone misrepresents a person's position or argument in order to make it sound easier to argue against them. Other examples are in a link in the description, but here's the most relevant one. I've talked about it a ton lately. You know it well. Football players in the NFL are taking a knee during the playing of the national anthem during games to protest racial injustice and police brutality. However, tons of people turn the conversation into they're disrespecting the flag and the military. Most football players have an immense respect for the military, and the flag doesn't even enter into conversations about race. Accusing them of protesting for those reasons makes it far easier to frame them as the enemy, when the whole point is to tackle the real issues so that they can resume being prideful about living in a country where they're allowed to express criticism about the situation they find themselves in. But there's a rule in the NFL that says they have to stand. First of all, that rule, if it really exists, was written during a time when ultimate and overall obedience and subservience in our citizens, up to and including simple traditions and etiquette yielding punishments, was accepted and encouraged, despite going wildly against the idea of being in a free country. The players are kneeling specifically during football games because when they peacefully protest outside of football, on the streets, out in the world at large, barely anyone who needs to pay attention is paying attention. They scroll past it on Facebook, they see their favorite conservative news sources get loud about them hating America and hating the flag and hating the country and being ingrate, etc., and bingo. Second of all, this just came out days ago. Link to the New York Post is in the description. NFL owners are encouraging players to stand, but they've ruled it is not required. So there you go. It's officially okay to kneel. The thing to remember about straw man arguments, and probably other fallacies and tactics that I'm talking about here, is that a person is reframing something they hear or see, and whether intentionally or unintentionally, they aren't addressing their own feelings or perceptions in the matter. I'll demonstrate what I mean with one of the examples in the link I posted. A senator says that they should not add money to the defense budget. Then another senator says they can't believe the first guy wants to leave the nation defenseless. Clearly the first guy doesn't want to live in a defenseless nation, but to me the second guy sounds afraid of being defenseless, doesn't he? Otherwise, why go to such an extreme? What makes him think we're going to be defenseless if no additional money is added to the budget? Looking at it the other way, how many more dollars would need to be added to that budget in order for the second guy to feel less defenseless? How much money is appropriate to add to that budget in order for all of us to feel like we're being defended? And similar aspect, does adding money to a defense budget instantly mean we're better defended? Is it a personal fear for him that his nation will be defenseless? And if it is, should that personal fear extend to everyone? A person can craft a straw man and think knocking it over seals victory, but by asking more focused questions, you can get to the root of why the claim doesn't carry much weight. I'll say this, and it relates a bit to my feelings about Twitter, which I made clear not too long ago. A lot more significant information than people think can be interpreted from the least word spoken. People think Twitter is just one big mic drop generator. Psst. Even though no arguments can end it there. You just have to be careful when digging through the few words people say that you don't go for the throat too quickly. Here's another interesting one. False equivalence. This is when two things are made to look the same when in reality they aren't all that close. The comparison is usually a result of one shared trait or factor, often one that's fairly thin. When you look up false equivalence on Google, the images tab shows a meme with an image of Jesus on the left and Hitler on the right, and on the bottom it says false equivalence. After all, they both have mustaches. Now, whether you're a fan of organized religion or National Socialism or neither or both, obviously those two people aren't anywhere the same, and the fact that they both have facial hair doesn't prove that in any way. A false equivalence people have made recently, and one that I'll admit my guilt in supporting, people looked at both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton as bad candidates and similar because they've both done bad things in their careers. Thus, many people either abstained during the vote like I did or voted third party. The idea here is that Hillary's political and or personal faults or errors in judgment were obviously nowhere close to Donald Trump's overall attitude or business decisions, which are usually seen as some of his selling points to his supporters. Trump is seen to have tons of money, so quote, obviously he's done something right. That's debatable. You can have tons of money and still made a mountain of mistakes in your life that would have doubled if not tripled the money you have had you not made them, or made them as hard. Or you can get around all the rules, take advantage of loopholes that shouldn't exist, or exploit various systems and still have lots of money. During the first debate, Hillary claimed Trump hadn't paid income tax for years. His response was, quote, that makes me smart. People wanted to frame that as him being stupid, because obviously smart people pay taxes. I interpreted it as he's smart because he likely knows some legal or slightly illegal loopholes to jump through, which probably would be exposed had he shared his tax returns, which he hasn't done yet. He can call people out on breaking rules and looks like a rebel that's fighting against oppressive and restrictive government politics and a defender of the law, but he can break any traditions he wants because obviously those traditions aren't the right ones. Sounds like something I pointed out earlier. What was it again? See, the problem with comparing any two things, people are attempting to see links and they'll sometimes make connections where they may not be dependable. A straw man requires additional interpretation that goes beyond simply addressing the main issue or problem, and if you're quick, they can illustrate how a person sees something, which is undoubtedly valuable information. But like I said, a straw man doesn't directly address a person's individual feelings on their own, even if it sort of exposes them a bit. False equivalence makes sense to call out, however, in some cases I would actually consider this a form of deflection. During the campaign, I did an exercise on social media. I asked friends of mine to say one positive thing about their candidate of choice, completely ignoring their candidate's opponent. Barely received any responses, the two I got not really meeting the request. A day later, I asked social media to say one negative thing about their candidate of choice, again, completely ignoring their candidate's opponent. I did this as an attempt to isolate each candidate to better clarify that equivalence to see how much of it was really there, to let their merits or lack thereof, whichever it happens to be, stand on their own, which I think is entirely fair. Of course, the limited responses I got back spoke just as loudly as if I had gotten over 1,000 responses. When people claim false equivalence, it tends to imply at least X isn't as bad as, which doesn't really go into more of the story. It just says A isn't the same as B. After Hillary Clinton received the nomination as the Democratic candidate for president, I saw the Role Models ad that I linked in the description, which is essentially 1 minute of Trump sound bites followed by a graphic on the screen that summarizes the situation by saying that kids are watching when Trump goes off the rails, then Hillary approving the message. She was essentially encouraging that false equivalence. You should be voting for me because look how bad he is. I'll grant the Role Models ad is pretty powerful. Trump calling Mexicans rapists, saying he could shoot someone in the street and not lose votes, kids seeing that. It's negative campaigning that Hillary's side didn't even have to work for. It completely cornered Republican voters by saying, you agree with Trump on these things, but how many of you, while railing against violence in movies and TV shows and video games, harmful images in media, would really be okay with your kids hearing these things? I think part of why this didn't work, however, is that it didn't say enough about Hillary herself. The entire argument was the assumption that she couldn't possibly be as bad as Trump saying these awful things, and all Republican voters had to do was go, I'm okay with him saying these things. In fact, I say them to my own kids. I'll reiterate, when people, myself included, included claim that all politicians are bad and therefore Trump and Hillary are the same due to that one thing, it is a false equivalence. Hillary and Trump are not the same, and if either care more about people in this country, I would believe Hillary does far more. Trump is a celebrity. He's an icon. The definition of figurehead. The exact type of brash, reckless loudmouth his supporters strive to be far more than a professional representative of them. He embodies that unapologetic arrogance that has crept into people's lives via sources like the internet. However, while I will admit to a false equivalence existing there, Hillary's had a long history in the public eye and Republicans have grown to not trust her. I said in my last video, sometimes you have to play the game a little and address the negativity that you face head on. I don't recall reading much about Hillary really tackling distrust people had in her, and if she did, it wasn't very hard. Conservatives have been allowed to stew on the private email server, Benghazi, and every other scandal that haunted her, and she did barely anything to repair or turn around that distrust. Last week tonight with John Oliver did an episode detailing the most points to prove why the biggest scandals she's been criticized for weren't nearly as bad as people make them out to be, gathering the most facts to exonerate her, and that's great, but she acted as if these concerns didn't matter much, and that's not the best way to endear yourself to people who don't trust you. The assumption by people like Susan Bordeaux, author of the book The Destruction of Hillary Clinton, is that misogyny led to the media bias that caused her to lose the election, and when it comes to how staunchly conservatives hold their beliefs, if they believe she's not trustworthy, whether due to misogyny or not, maybe Bordeaux has some small point. However, while Bordeaux can call out misogyny, what is it called when your assumption that people won't believe you causes you to just not bother trying to change their lack of faith? Calling attention to that false equivalence between her and Trump is one thing. It's a thing that Hillary herself approved of, and I would agree with being accurate. They aren't much the same at all. However, working hard to prove to people who don't trust you just how false that equivalence is entirely another. One thing many politicians forget is that achieving more votes often means convincing people on the other side to convert. It's why many felt that George W. Bush and Al Gore, outside of some fundamental differences in terms of policy, were largely the same, enough so to be only about 200,000 votes apart in bringing about the whole hanging Chad thing. If memory serves, they were moderates who were too concerned with pleasing the other side and not the ideals of their party. And then 9/11 hit. And since then, we've seen politicians separate more and more into being idealists and extremists, almost caricatures of who their parties represent. Hillary was nominated to represent a collective of people who feel marginalized, oppressed, stepped on, and pushed aside, and by not fighting hard enough in the right ways, and by not being nearly as driven and smart as a politician, she won. She gets to be the biggest victim in America, and we're all paying the price. Even Trump supporters are paying for it, whether they know it or not. Last one I'm going to talk about, and I only just started seeing this one months ago, but it's proving really interesting to think about: virtue signaling. Google defines this as the action or practice of publicly expressing opinions or sentiments intended to demonstrate one's good character or the moral correctness of one's position on a particular issue. Obviously, using the term virtue kind of suggests that there's some arrogance there, just how good a person you are or how altruistic your position is. That's fair to point out. We've all known people who broadcast good deeds they've done a bit too much, right? A college professor shared with me years ago the quote, "There's no such thing as a good deed." The idea being that pretty much everything we do for some type of selfish reason. Donating to charity, volunteering, helping others. We do these things seemingly because we care about people, but they provide satisfaction, tax deductions, pride, etc., and therefore they're not truly good deeds but ways to benefit ourselves. It makes sense, though I think declaring that just because a person feels good about helping others and feeling good is a personal thing, to be frank, that kind of sounds like a false equivalence, no? Helping others isn't selfish just because a person feels good doing it. Did you drop money in the Salvation Army bucket on Christmas, ask the bell ringer for a receipt, then take a selfie with them that you posted on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, etc. with the hashtag #ICareAboutPeopleBitches? Or did you pull your scarf up over your face, drop money in the bucket, nod to the bell ringer, and walk away without telling a soul? Big difference there. One is done solely for attention, personal gain, compliments, ego stroking, image maintenance. The other is entirely anonymous. Funny thing is though, I've heard people call out virtue signaling when citing a person doing something. Virtue signaling seems worth calling out due to the signaling part, meaning communicating what good a person is doing is more important than that person actually doing good by itself. It's one thing to brag about caring for people less fortunate than you while sitting at home watching reality TV and jerking off, and another to brag about caring for people less fortunate than you while donating a ton of money to charity, marching in a Fight for 15 rally to raise the minimum wage, standing front and center to protest how low-income workers are treated, pushing legislators to shine more spotlight on unemployment, and then be accused of virtue signaling. James Bartholomew, the man who coined the phrase, wrote in The Spectator about the popularizing of the phrase, quote, "One of the crucial aspects of virtue signaling is that it does not require actually doing anything virtuous. It does not involve delivering lunches to elderly neighbors or staying together with a spouse for the sake of the children. It takes no effort or sacrifice at all," unquote. Link to the article he says that is in the description. James even quotes Helen Lewis, who wrote, "A lot of what happens on Facebook, as with Twitter, is virtue signaling, showing off how right on you are." I completely agree. The overabundance of the signaling or broadcasting is the real problem. The whole no such thing as a good deed idea aside, if you're actually doing things and taking some action, then a person can potentially be virtuous. Not everyone is a self-centered jerk just looking for attention or praise simply because they tell others about what they do. Situations aren't black and white. There's gray area. Imagine that. Though similar to gaslighting, I feel like this is also hard to nail down sometimes. How do you go about proving a random stranger online is virtue signaling? Better question, do you even have to? The guy who coined the phrase didn't seem to think so. Honestly, that's pretty dangerous. This means anyone can be accused of this, regardless of how much good they actually do. When I think about it, I almost feel weird including this one, as it doesn't even seem like an argument tactic at all. It's just an accusation you can throw at someone to discredit them without needing any proof, evidence, or backup. How exactly do you communicate something on the internet, a place where you have access to everyone else on the planet with a connection, and not seem like you're virtue signaling in some small way? Pretty much anyone and everyone can be called out for this. This person is signaling how great an eater they are. This person is signaling how much they give to charity. This person is signaling how much they give a shit about GMOs 1 minute, then they ignore that 3 months later, and now they give a shit about the Dakota Access Pipeline, because despite all the time they spend Facebooking and Twittering about how much wine they drink, hashtag water is life. In fact, I feel like this is probably the best one to end on, as all of these things seem to be rooted in one single sentiment. Almost everything can be considered a logical fallacy or informal fallacy, or just simply have a name attached to them, and then once something has a name or is identifiable, then people can pick it out in conversation, and then they have reason or method to say someone's word isn't worth anything. The people who are best at arguing are good at both addressing diversions and bringing the argument back to the point. One thing I've learned when reading more about these tactics and devices lately is that with so much overlap between them and the common ways people utilize them, ultimately much of this is pretty pointless to bring up in a formal debate. No, I didn't just waste your time. Let me finish. I'm almost done. See, you can't really throw a word like gaslighting at someone during a fight and watch them go, oh shit, you're right, I was totally gaslighting, I'm so sorry. That's not happening. Things like that just end up confusing situations. It can change a debate, which should be focused on the issue, into getting more personal, because now accusations are thrown out about manipulation and diversion and intention. Truth is, arguing a point effectively is tough. It requires laser focus on the topic at hand and a clear enough head to both fend off diversions and stay on track. Really all you can do. This is the main reason that I want to have discussions and not debate. In discussions, people are working together on a similar goal. These types of tactics rarely come up in an informal discussion, and if they do, they're not strategies used to win anything. It's not a scenario like a debate where people rarely ever win these days anyway. These things only come up when harsh enough disagreements occur, and that disagreement creates enough of an impasse that people try harder to convince each other of things than actually solving the problem. If you get into a verbal fight with someone, your best defense is simple. Listening to them, hearing them, watching them, understanding them, knowing them, seeing them for who they are as they show themselves to you little by little, rather than who you want them to be to prove you're justified in attacking them, whether defensively or offensively. Also to keep in mind, something that's a lot harder to address, in this video I'm just talking about the verbal aspect. There's also the non-verbal aspects. Fox ran a short-lived drama called Lie to Me. It starred Tim Roth as Cal Lightman, an expert in non-verbals and micro-expressions, the ways our movements and faces and twitches say more about us than our actual words. You know full well just how seriously people take words. You use the right words, they'll trigger people into a litany of emotions. You've heard the little ditty, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Seems like that old adage has gone by the wayside a long time ago, because words these days hold a ton of power. I don't know how much real science went into the show Lie to Me. Seems like a lot, but my favorite part about it was when a character on the show would make a particular face, Cal would say, he's lying, and the show would provide a bunch of real life instances of people we know from the news making the exact same faces when confronted with similar feelings. I linked the opening scene of the pilot in the description, but the best part comes near the end when Cal says, quote, these expressions are universal. Emotion looks the same whether you're a suburban housewife or a suicide bomber. The truth is written on all of our faces, unquote. You gotta be observant to see it, but it's there. What people say, the arguments they choose, those things are important, yeah, but taking into account how people act, their feelings below the surface, it all factors in when trying to get to the bottom of things. And just about every time it requires us to look into the faces of people we deem enemies, people we don't like, people we hate. It requires us to open our ears to them, hear what they say, and put it all together. One last thing. Just because you fight with someone, that doesn't make them your enemy. It just makes them your opponent. Do you want enemies or do you want teammates? Sounds obvious, right? Who wants enemies? Plenty of people like the idea of being hated. They revel in it. They thrive in it. Some people feel more validated being hated than being loved. And that type of trait is also becoming easier to pick out. I may hate Twitter, but here's a little something for tweeters out there. Hashtag life is co-op, not PvP. This is Killer Cardinal DA7 reminding you to use your head, be nice to each other, and take the time to think. Talk to you later.
Finish him. D'Vorah wins. Fatality.